Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar to talk about the content and implications of the recently introduced Bill number 5 into the Ontario Legislature. My name is Tim Gray and I'm Executive Director here at Environmental Defence Canada. If you don't know us, Environmental Defence is a leading Canadian advocacy organization, works with government, industry, and individuals to defend clean water, a safe climate, and healthy communities. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. My colleagues and I are in Toronto today, which is the long-standing territory of the Anishinaabe, Wendat, and Haudenosaunee peoples, and treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. Today, we have a number of special guests with us who are going to give you all of the gory details about Bill 5. We have Laura Bowman, who's a lawyer with Ecojustice. We have Justina Ray, who's president and senior scientist at Wildlife Conservation Society Canada. Anaïs Bussières, McNicoll, who is Fundamental Freedoms Director at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Welcome to all of you. Great to have you here tonight. Just before we dive into our first presentation, I just want to provide a little bit of context for the presentations and the conversations that we're going to have this evening. Bill 5, entitled the Protect Ontario by Unleashing Our Economy Act, which is a mouthful and, as you'll see tonight, a little bit Orwellian, would give Premier Ford, his cabinet, and his friends unprecedented power over our communities, our health, and our lives. It is an omnibus bill, which means it makes many changes to many laws, all in one large package. These changes include establishing the power for the Premier and his cabinet to make designated companies or individuals to be exempt from following any or all provincial and municipal laws in any place at any time and for any reason that they may subsequently decide. The government calls these special economic zones. We call this the Henry VIII law because of the proposed takeover of the powers of the legislature that it represents. Secondly is the repeal of Ontario's Endangered Species Act, which protects the most rare and vulnerable plants and animals in Ontario. Third are major changes to the Mining Act, which override environmental reviews and due process for consideration of social and Indigenous impacts. Number 4, canceling of environmental reviews for a proposed dump on a major Southern Ontario river, and also one for the proposed Eagle's Nest mine in Northern Ontario. And last but not least, removing the requirements for archaeological assessments for major projects in Ontario that, that put settler and Indigenous history and culture at grave risk. These types of omnibus bills are meant to overwhelm the public and the media and follow closely on the flood the zone approach being used by the Trump administration in the US to overwhelm their democratic system. Tonight, you will hear more about special economic zones and the Endangered Species Act changes in particular. This is because of time constraints to cover all this evening, but also because these two aspects of the bill are going to have the most widespread and threatening consequences as far as we can tell. I also want to explain just a little bit about where we are in the process of passing this bill in the legislature. It has passed second reading, which means it will now be sent to legislative committee. This committee is called the Committee of the Interior, and there will be 2 days of public hearings held on May 22nd and May 26th. A number of our organizations are applying to present there, and this will provide us an opportunity to explain both to MPPs in the government side of the House, but also to opposition MPPs what some of the failings of this bill is and how it should be changed. Just before we launch into introducing in more detail our presenters this evening, I just really want to make sure that I give you some instructions about how to use, you can interact with us on this webinar, because sometimes it can be a little bit confusing. So at the bottom of your screen, you can see a button called Q&A. If you hit that button and type in your questions, Our team is going to relay them to me. We usually get a large volume of questions, especially this evening when we have so many people on this call. So we won't get to them all, but we'll try to get to as many as possible and make sure that all of your questions get answered. So let's get started. Our first presenter this evening is Laura Bowman. Laura is a lawyer with Ecojustice Canada in Toronto. She was called to the Ontario Bar in 2007 and has a Juris Doctor from the University of Toronto and an LLM from Osgoode in administrative law. She has lived and practiced in 3 different provinces and in Nunavut, so she knows her environmental law well. And I work with Laura all the time. She represents environmental groups, First Nations, and community groups at all levels of court and judicial reviews. She is on Ecojustice's Healthy Communities team and is fascinated by sprawl and food systems and how they drive the triple planetary crisis: climate emergency, toxics and pollution, and biodiversity loss. Again, be sure to think of any questions you might have for her as she gives her presentation, because we'll be coming to them all at the end. And we have our live Q&A in the second half of the webinar. Laura.
Thanks so much for inviting me here today. And just a little bit of background about Ecojustice. We are a national environmental law charity, and we represent environmental organizations, community groups, and First Nations in all kinds of environmental issues across the country. So just to get right into it here, breaking down Bill 5 into those 2 big components that Tim mentioned earlier, the Special Economic Zones Act and the changes to the Endangered Species Act. Schedule 9 of Bill 5 contains a new piece of legislation called the Special Economic Zones Act. And this is a really important piece of the bill. It can give overriding powers to cabinet and the minister, which kind of transcend all of the other aspects of the bill. The big piece in the Special Economic Zones Act is that cabinet can create these special economic zones. And once those zones are created, the minister can designate trusted proponents and projects within those zones. A key piece is that both of these things can be done, the creation of the zones and the designation of proponents and projects, for any reason and in any location. There's a lot of rhetoric around the bill being about the Ring of Fire, and it does seem that the government intends to use the bill in Northern Ontario, but the bill in no way limits those powers to Northern Ontario. Any place in Ontario can be designated as a special economic zone, and any proponent or project, not just Ring of Fire projects, can be designated. They can also be designated for any reason. There is no purpose clause in this bill. It doesn't say it's for the development of the Ring of Fire. It doesn't say that it's for building homes. The bill is just a blank slate allowing the creation of these zones for any reason in any place, and the designation of any kind of proponent or project. There's also no process in the bill. There's no procedures that cabinet or the minister have to follow before they make these designations. There is no transparency requirements around considering the designations or applying for the designations. There's no criteria for these designations spelled out in the bill. So there are really no guardrails around the use of these powers. Once these things are designated, they can be exempted from any applicable provincial law. So that's not just environmental laws. It can be any kind of law dealing with health, safety, the environment. Municipal bylaws are included in these potential exemptions. And so really what this is it's the creation of sacrifice zones where provincial laws don't apply. Perhaps cabinet will put in place some other set of rules. We have no idea what those will look like. And it's really an unbounded type of power, which hands power from the legislature, who has enacted all of these provincial laws, to cabinet and the minister without any legislative oversight. So that means, Toronto could be designated a special economic zone, and the City of Toronto Act would no longer apply. Any area in Ontario could be designated, any project, any proponent of a project can be included in one of these sacrifice zones, and we have no idea what the legal regime would then look like in that zone. And I think it's worth remembering that in Ontario, we once had a rebellion in the 1830s to ensure that the legislature could hold cabinet accountable, and that this would effectively reverse that in these places and take us back to the 19th century in terms of how our democracy would be functioning. And so I think this is a very alarming piece of this bill, and I know that some of the other speakers will get into this as well. So I'll move on to the Endangered Species Act. So Schedules 2 and 10 would, once fully implemented, have the effect of repealing the Endangered Species Act from 2007. And replacing it with something called the Species Conservation Act. This Species Conservation Act really resembles the Endangered Species Act in no meaningful way. Recovery of species, so getting species in decline back to a stable population that is functional in a biological sense, is no longer a goal of the legislation. Things that were heavily regulated under the former Endangered Species Act would no longer be regulated. Things like harassment of endangered species. So, having a construction site next to a species or their habitat, no longer regulated at all. The definition of habitat that is regulated by the bill, I'm not going to use the word protected because I don't think this bill actually protects the habitat that it regulates. But the habitat that is regulated is then limited down to the dwelling place of an animal in the immediate area necessary for the dwelling place. So a dwelling place would be something like a den or a nest, for example. And for plants, only the critical root area would be regulated. We know that these are species that are already in decline, usually because of habitat loss. So regulating an area of habitat that is less than what they need to survive effectively ensures their continued decline and perhaps extirpation or extinction. Even those pieces that are regulated still, so the killing of a species, the destruction of that dwelling place or that critical root zone, is then subject to what is effectively an automatic registration system. So if the person who wants to kill the animal or cut down the tree wants to proceed, all they have to do is file a form and pay a fee, and then there's a requirement in this bill for the registration of that activity to take place, which would then authorize that activity. Some activities could be permitted, but there are no rules around when permits can be issued. So it's not really much better protection than the automatic registrations. This will be catastrophic for species, and I know that Justina is going to talk about those details a little bit more. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Laura. We are going to switch now to Dr. Justina Ray. Dr. Ray has served as president and senior scientist of Wildlife Conservation Society since its founding in 2004. In addition to leading research initiatives, she has contributed to numerous government advisory panels on species at risk, including the Ontario Endangered Species Act Legislative Review Advisory Panel, the Committee on the Status of Species at Risk in Ontario, you may have heard it by its acronym, CSIRO, and the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, COSEWIC. She is also an adjunct professor at both the University of Toronto and Trent University. Justina.
Well, hello, thank you. Next, please. Just to begin, WCS Canada, we are a national organization working at the science policy interface on nature and climate issues across the country. In Ontario, we're mostly up in the far north, so please visit our website and socials. If you haven't heard of us, I'm happy to answer questions after this. Next slide, please. So I just want to start out by sort of giving two starkly different pictures of Ontario. This is two ways of seeing it, one through the extractive potential and the other through its natural heritage. And so on the left, you see nickel, which is really important economically. It's also important for the energy transition. But on the right, in the same places, you'll see that these are overlapping with critically important wetlands, which provide essential ecological functions, such as storing carbon, filtering water, buffering floods, storing species, and supporting biodiversity. So these values are both at play. And I think the take-home message here in this slide that you'll be in this presentation is how much the ecological function is not really being dealt with. And so my job here is to sort of talk to you about these consequences. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about this in sort of first to sort of get through to like how important the treasures we have in Ontario. And I'm going to do this in four ways. First, Ontario has over 250,000 lakes, contains about 1/3 of Canada's surface freshwater, extraordinary concentration of aquatic ecosystems. These aren't just water bodies, but they support globally significant biodiversity, all sorts of habitats for small sensitive species, Niagara escarpment in the far north, very highly localized aquatic species and incredible biodiversity. Next. And so of the approximately 80,000 species in Canada, over 25,000 are found in Ontario. So it's the most biodiverse province. And why is this? It's not only because it's such a huge area, but because it spans tremendous latitudes, but also sits at this continental crossroads where northern boreal systems meet southern Ontario temperate zone. And this overlap really is extensive species. And southern Ontario in particular is one of the most biodiverse regions in the country in spite of being heavily developed. Next slide. Third, Ontario's wetlands are quite something, both south and north. These provide vital ecological services. They clean water, they regulate floods, they sustain wildlife. In the north in particular, these are vast peatlands, and they are concentrated in the Hudson Bay lowlands, which is the second largest peatland complex on the planet. And although peatlands as an ecosystem make up only 3% of the global land surface, they store an estimated 25 to 30% of all the world's soil carbon. And so the Hudson Bay lowlands is a prime example of something that's doing this extraordinary amount of work actually helping to cool the planet. These ecosystems form slowly over thousands of years, and if you disturb them, we're very liable of releasing stored carbon, and recovering their function is almost impossible over a period of time that we have. Next slide. And the fourth example is Ontario serves as just this crucial passageway for migratory birds. There's two enormously important flyways of hemispheric importance that pass right through Ontario. So familiar sites like Point Pelee, Long Point in the south, James Bay in the north. These are important stopping and resting sites for birds that are flying all the way from the Arctic all the way to the bottom of the southern cone. And so these examples just show how important Ontario is, not only for the species and ecosystems it holds, but the services it provides. And this picture is changing. The values we've just seen, wetlands, species richness, freshwater, migratory stopovers, are all under significant pressure. And that's the starting point of where we are. Next slide. So Ontario is experiencing significant climate change at faster rates than the global average. Next slide. We also have a significant number of species at risk that keeps mounting. We've got about 230 right now. Next slide. And in southern Ontario, where biodiversity is most concentrated, we've already lost the majority of our original wetland and forest cover. Next slide. So these impacts, climate vulnerability, species decline, habitat loss, they're not just random or inevitable. These are symptoms of a broader failure of the safeguards we've already had in place that we've relied on. Ontario's species and ecosystems just don't have strong enough protection to begin with. We've seen these are indicators of erosion over time. And Ontario's unique ecological position, means that there's a ton at stake. Next slide. And we're learning, sometimes the hard way, that these systems are not only ecologically important, but also fundamental to human health, community resilience, and long-term economic well-being. And so it's against this backdrop that Bill 5 has dropped. It's been introduced, putting these very values at risk. And so I'm going to highlight 3 areas where I'm most concerned. And, these are high level. Next slide. First, the focus of this bill is really on individual projects and activities. And this represents really a formalized shift away from kind of integrated landscape planning where we were going for a while in Ontario, to something that really fragments oversight and undermines our ability to manage cumulative effects of development. So in a project-based approach, like depicted on the left, approvals happen in isolation with little regard for surrounding habitat, species, long-term ecosystem function, or even coordinated and long-term economic planning. And so the larger planning processes allow for bigger picture thinking. That's really, really critical at this point. They allow you to proactively think about protected sensitive areas, considering land use, managing cumulative effects, and so on. And this plays out across the province in different ways. Next slide. My second concern is that Bill 5 allows delays or even refusals to list species at risk, to acknowledge that they are in peril, even when the scientific evidence clearly supports this. Without formal recognition, these species sort of fall behind the scenes. They fall quietly. They're out of sight, out of mind. The narrow approach to habitat protection that Laura just described, it'll provide just a ton of discretion to allow development, even in areas. I mean, this is just sort of like protecting the bedroom in your house, or even just the bed, and not acknowledging that you need the rest of the house for other things. Recovery strategies are also core tools that are disappearing from the Act. These are blueprints for understanding how to manage species, recover them, to even have goals. So conservation becomes piecemeal and really fundamentally optional. Next slide. And finally, the development in the Ring of Fire, that's a huge priority. That's the first priority in the Premier's letter to the Prime Minister the other day. I think it was yesterday. Bill 5 helps clear the way. It allows for the creation of these special zones. And one of the significant consequences is that, these peatlands that I was talking about before don't receive protection. These are hugely important for the world. And again, once disturbed, these ecosystems will release more carbon than they absorb. And, that could undermine any of our efforts elsewhere to try and reduce emissions. So this is not just a local issue, it matters for the planet. Next slide. So to conclude, the Bill 5 isn't just a policy update, it's part of a continuing shift in Ontario's approach to conservation, where clear rules are replaced by political discretion, and it just becomes kind of random and piecemeal and not very strategic. And so this has consequences towards this fragmented fast-track development approach, which will just invite cumulative effects no matter where we are in the province. And so I'll close with that, and thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Justina. Next, we have Anaïs McNicoll. Anaïs is the Director of Fundamental Freedoms Program and the Interim Director of the Privacy, Technology and Surveillance Program at Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Since joining CCLA, Anaïs has fought in various forums for the respect of fundamental rights and freedoms. She has criticized in parliamentary committees federal and provincial bills that infringed on freedom of expression and freedom of association. She also speaks regularly in the media, including to defend people's rights to use their civic space to protest peacefully. Anaïs.
Thank you, and hello everyone. It's a pleasure to appear in this webinar today, and I'd like to thank Environmental Defense for hosting this event and for inviting me. As mentioned, I'm the director of the Fundamental Freedoms Program at the CCLA, and for those of you who might not know us, the CCLA is an independent, national, non-governmental organization that was founded in 1964 with a mandate to defend and foster the civil liberties, human rights, and democratic freedoms of all people across Canada. And key aspects of our mission include fighting against government overreach and advocating for government accountability and transparency. And I'm here with you today to share with you CCLA's deep concerns when it comes to Schedule 9 of Bill 5. And if we can move to the next slide, I would say that the simplest way to describe Schedule 9 is to say that it's a power grab. And that's because this schedule is a direct attack from the executive branch of government against some of the most basic democratic principles that we have, such as the rule of law and the separation of powers. And as mentioned by Laura, in a nutshell, what Schedule 9 does is it allows the Minister of Economic Development, Job Creation and Trade to exempt trusted proponents or designated projects from having to comply with any provincial and municipal law within a special economic zone. And we have three main concerns with respect to this schedule. First, it empowers the minister to circumvent the rule of law. And the rule of law is this very basic principles, which provides that in a democracy, the law applies to everybody, including to the government and to friends of the government. And Schedule 9 grants the government a broad power to circumvent the rule of law because the bill, as mentioned, refers to any provincial and municipal law. So there's a clear risk that this bill will be used to exempt corporations that are handpicked by the government from having to comply with environmental law, labor laws, health and safety laws, local planning laws, municipal zoning laws, what else? Privacy laws, why not? That's not impossible. So that's very, very broad. And also another thing that we believe is clear is that this bill risks being weaponized against vulnerable and marginalized communities, including, of course, Indigenous groups and people living in poverty. So what this attack on the rule of law does is it creates lawless zones where the executive power, instead of the legislature, has the last say. And this leads me to my second point, which is that this bill also undermines the usual democratic process. And I use the term democratic process to refer to a series of constitutional principles underpinning a liberal democracy, such as ours. And one of them is the separation of powers. So as you might know, the state power is usually separated between three branches: the legislature, which adopts laws, the executive, the government, and the judiciary, courts. And the separation of powers is crucial to keeping the government of the day accountable and restricting the arbitrary exercise of government power. So the legislature ensures that the government exercises its powers in line with the expectations of citizens, and the judiciary ensures that the government exercises its powers in accordance with our Constitution. And one way the legislature ensures that the government's actions are in line with the will of the people is by engaging in what we call a democratic dialogue whenever a bill is tabled. So the legislature, along with civil society, can weigh in on the content of a bill and suggest amendments. But an efficient dialogue requires that the government introduce detailed legislation, not undefined terms that will be left to the government's later discretion. So by introducing three new concepts that are not defined, well, their meanings are left entirely to the cabinet's discretions, and they can mean pretty much anything. So our position is that if Ontario is to create new thresholds, they should define these thresholds in the bill and allow for the usual democratic dialogue between the executive and legislative powers to take place. What the government should not do, and what it is doing right now, is give itself carte blanche to land on any threshold it wants and to modify these thresholds at will without any accountability and transparency. And my third and last point is that essentially the government is telling us that they need this pace of legislation because they need to be able to act swiftly in the face of the current economic uncertainty. So that's another way of saying that there is no time for the rule of law and democratic dialogue, and we definitely disagree with this approach. It is true that in times of absolute crisis, a government may need exceptional powers, including the power to govern without having to go through the legislature or to abide by laws. But we're talking here about urgent threats to the very fabric of our society. So, for instance, pandemics, as we know well, and wars. Here, we definitely have an attempt by the government of Ontario to normalize the use of exceptional emergency powers. And we believe that this is an attempt that all Ontario residents should call out. And these type of powers should be the democratic exception, not the norm. And even if we were in an exceptional situation, well, emergency powers are subject to checks and balances. For instance, clear and exigent statutory thresholds, temporary duration, and some level of democratic oversight. For instance, having to go back to the legislature every few months to justify the need to continue using extraordinary powers. And it's very obvious that Schedule 9 fails on all of those counts. So this is definitely an issue that we are monitoring closely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anaïs. We're going to move to questions right now. A number of you, quite a few of you, have put them into the Q&A chat, and Mike has been pulling them all together and organizing them a bit for me so that I can go through them. I think the way that I'm going to do this is actually go to some of the questions that are related to the content of the presentations. And then closer to the end, I'm going to circle back to issues around process, pushback, and housekeeping, just because I think that kind of structure makes the most sense. So let's start with some of the implications first, and I will assign these questions to each of our panelists, if that makes sense. Some of the process ones I'll address myself, but the first one here is, does this bill apply to provincial parks? And Laura, why don't you take that one?
Yes, it does. So any area of Ontario can be designated a special economic zone under the Special Economic Zones Act. That can include a provincial park. Provincial parks are not excluded from that. And the changes to protections for endangered species also apply across Ontario, although there are additional things in parks legislation.
Thanks. And the next question is similar. Someone was asking, so the Greenbelt and Oak Ridges moraine laws can be usurped by Schedule 9, so green belts are no longer safe, and of course that would be true as well. The next one says, just to be perfectly clear, from what Laura said, the Ontario Heritage Act could be completely overridden in a special economic zone. In other words, if the government had declared Ontario Place a special economic zone, they could have sidestepped all the furor and inquiries that have ensued. Is that correct?
Yes,
Laura.
any place in Ontario can be designated a special economic zone, and after that, any applicable law can be exempt from any applicable law. The trusted proponent and/or project within that zone can be law-free unless Cabinet decides to apply some new rule to them.
And Justina, there's a question here about looking to connect the dots more fully, I guess, between this bill, the endangered species component, and climate change. I think you did some of that, but maybe just maybe emphasize that a little bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, this bill, just any area that many parts of Ontario, and particularly the far north, and that's why I really spent some time emphasizing that the land is very important from a climate perspective because of the carbon that's stored in there, and that's not just in the far north, but in other areas. So when these are disturbed, there are consequences that are not always very well quantified, but if development is allowed to proceed without really considering the pace and scale and so on, then the consequences for carbon emissions are fairly significant, and particularly in the far north. It's a great example up there as to why an approach that only deals with sort of piecemeal decision making at a project scale, one decision at a time, is not going to be very good at all. It's going to be very dangerous for managing climate in the future. So you need a more strategic approach.
Thanks. Maybe I'll just add something to that as well, is that if you think of Southern Ontario, Justina was just mentioning during her presentation how incredibly important Southern Ontario is in terms of protecting endangered species, because we have lost a lot of habitat and there are a lot of endangered species here. We have a number of species, especially around Toronto and into extreme Southern Ontario, Lake Erie, that exist elsewhere. They exist in the US, a lot more higher populations of them. And that has been used as an excuse to say, well, we don't need to worry about the examples that exist in Ontario because there's lots of them in the US. But that's the interesting thing about species populations, is there's lots of genetic variety in those populations. And the endangered trees and plants and animals that exist here at the very northern end of some of these ranges could have particular adaptations that would allow them to move northward as the climate changes. And if you erase that gene pool, you may not be, the ones that are further south may not be able to adapt and move north as quickly, et cetera. So being able to maintain that genetic diversity across the range is really important. And then, of course, and maybe I'll just mention this isn't a science issue, it's a human civilization issue, is that the idea that we would have a government so immoral that they would think it's okay to wipe out incredibly rare species that may exist nowhere else on the planet, or wipe them out from Canada at a whim for special friends that they anoint, is just offensive, regardless of whether or not it's scientifically important, which we know it is. It's just offensive. Next, what do we have? What did the federal government say about Ontario proposing to repeal the Endangered Species Act? Would federal laws, such as the Fisheries Act, the Species at Risk Act, the federal one, continue to apply in special economic zones? Maybe, Laura, that sounds like one for you.
Yes, the provincial government doesn't have jurisdiction to exclude the application of federal law. Interestingly, the bill just says applicable law. So I don't know if that's what they think they're trying to do, but they wouldn't have jurisdiction to do it if they are. The federal laws would still continue to apply. I think it's important to realize, though, that the protections that were in the Endangered Species Act, for example, were more robust in many ways than what is available federally for many species. So there are a lot of species that are listed federally that don't have habitat that is protected outside of federal lands. And there are also species that are not listed federally that were protected under the provincial ESA before these changes come into place. And there are also some pretty big differences under things like the Fisheries Act compared to endangered species legislation. It is much easier to destroy fish habitat for non-endangered species than it is for species that were protected under the ESA. So it still represents a significant reduction in protection, even for those species that have some federal protections.
Yeah, and if I might add to that, the question also said, so what does the federal government say? And we have no idea, because this law was, of course, brought onto the table when the federal government was slightly distracted. And is still, you know, we don't even have departments that have formed yet. And so, of course, there's not going to be a statement anytime soon on this. The other thing to say is that the bewildering array of species at risk laws that exist, you know, because of federal and provincial responsibility and so forth, was dealt with in 1996 through a really lovely accord for you know, species at risk, which most of the provinces and territories signed with the federal government, which really was like, we are going to cooperate. It was shortly after the Convention on Biological Diversity was signed, and the jurisdictions were all like, we need cooperation because there's federal and provincial land, and particularly for those species that were habitat loss is the key threat, that we're all going to cooperate. And so this law really flies in the face of that. The accord is still a signed thing. It is a thing on the website and what everybody's agreed to, but really this does effectively trash that commitment from a provincial perspective.
Thanks, Justina. Let's go to the next one. Special economic zones. Have the criteria been set for creating special economic zones? To clarify Anaïs's point, the 3 new terms to be defined by Cabinet, example, designated projects, special economic zones, and trusted proponents, are those defined at all, or is this to be done on a more ad hoc basis? Maybe Anaïs, you want to
Sure.
respond to that one?
So as of today, those terms have not been defined. So the bill in Section 9 does not define these 3 terms. It leaves it to Cabinet, so the executive arm of the government, to define those terms at a later stage and without any democratic dialogue or public consultation. And yes, the Cabinet can very well land on a definition of special economic zone and then reassess the definition and modify it in the future. So we won't necessarily have a final information ever about what those terms mean because the Cabinet has the discretion to modify them at will.
Thank you.
So I think it bears mentioning just for really quickly is that there has many senior officials have been out in the media saying that we shouldn't worry about this because there will be coordinated permitting and good criteria and so on, but it begs the question why they aren't in this bill, and we're interpreting the letter of the law in this instance.
Yeah, that's right. What can local councils do to stop this bill, Schedule 9 in this bill, from overriding their own master plans or municipal plans, I guess, which in some cases offer more protection for the environment than provincial laws do? Laura?
They can stop this bill from being passed. Because if this bill passes, Cabinet will have discretion to declare municipalities special economic zones and create law-free zones within municipalities, including exempting trusted proponents and projects from municipal bylaws and official plans and that entire regime.
And here's another one related to experience of other citizens in other countries dealing with Canadian mining companies. It says, could companies be enabled to use violence to carry out their projects, as has happened with Canadian mining companies operating abroad? Maybe Anaïs, maybe you would speak to that.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understood. Could they be allowed to use what?
Use violence, to carry out
Violence?
their yeah.
Okay, no, so criminal law would still apply, thankfully. So federal legislation would still apply, and also the provincial government hasn't and cannot override many charter rights. And so, for instance, Section 7 rights would still apply, right to life, liberty, and security of the person.
Thank you. Indigenous rights. The province can't, someone says the province can't override Indigenous sovereignty, and I guess that's as a question, and that Ring of Fire is covered by Treaty 9. How does the province feel that they can pass this law, which seems to violate required consultation and Indigenous treaty rights? Laura, maybe you could speak to that.
So it's true, they can't override treaties or Aboriginal rights, but to the extent that what the province does under legislation that interferes with those rights, that would normally trigger the duty to consult because there is a regulatory decision involved. Getting rid of the regulatory decisions does have a prejudicial impact on Indigenous rights because the duty to consult is linked to those regulatory decisions. So if you create a law-free sacrifice zone, and then you say, well, we're going to comply with the duty to consult. Well, you've created a regime under which there are questions now about the extent of a duty to consult, and the extent to which the government is interfering with Indigenous rights versus this trusted proponent, right? So by creating this chaotic and confusing law-free person, entity, and zone, they are undermining Indigenous rights, and it is prejudicial to Indigenous people.
Thanks, Laura. We have one more question here, more on the content side, and then I'm going to go to some of the questions around strategy and what next. This is with regard to the U.S. tariffs and that conflict. Question being, does this bill play into Premier Ford's AmCam or America-Canada trade plans, and which is to tie Ontario's economy more to the United States? And why would we be doing that when there's seems to be coming from Canadians and from the Prime Minister a sense that we need to pivot to different kinds of relationships? This seems to actually want to tie us more to them. I don't know who to assign that to. Anyone want to have a go at that?
I think at least to the extent that this is a power grab for the executive, and the changes to the Endangered Species Act parallel in large part what we're seeing in the United States. So the same week that Ontario tabled this bill, Trump made major changes to the Endangered Species Act in the US. So for, the rhetoric to match the reality around, wanting to be distinct from the United States, that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is that we're creating a regime that parallels the kind of executive power that we're seeing in the United States, and where favoritism and a chaotic system can be paralleled as well.
I do think it's worth mentioning, though, that a lot of this is under the cloak, if you will, of deregulation, which is quite apart from the circumstance that was just described in the question, but is actually embraced by political parties of all stripes, which is our way out of the economic duress from the tariffs is to go back to our roots as hewers of wood and haulers of water, which is to use our natural resources and as a means to get out of our economic fix. And all political parties are going down this pathway, which includes getting rid of red tape, deregulating as much as possible. And so we do have to acknowledge that this is not just a Ford government sort of pathway.
Thanks, Justina. And Laura, maybe I'll just add something, and then we'll pivot to some of the closing questions here, mainly around a process and what next. But there is some parallels between this bill and what's being pushed for by some of the billionaires in the US. They're looking to get the Trump administration to create things called freedom cities. And these would be places that would be run by CEOs, and the laws of in the US would be suspended, and the rules of how that society would work in those freedom cities would be determined by the billionaire CEOs who have been given broad powers of governance in those areas. So it's part of kind of an international push to erase the rule of law and turn it over to oligarchs, essentially. Next, a couple of questions here that I might be able to answer, but a couple of others not. Here's one that is, could Bill 5 be the subject of a Charter of Rights challenge as being inconsistent with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms? And the second part of that is, so if so, why aren't we challenging this in the courts? Either Anaïs or Laura might want to answer that one.
Sure, I can start, and maybe Laura can add anything she wants. I'd say first that right now we're pretty much focused on fighting this bill and hoping that it doesn't pass. And now, if it does pass, that would be the moment to challenge it in front of courts. I have a few thoughts. I think there would be potential ways to challenge it from a structural standpoint, but also to wait and see how it's being applied and to challenge it then as well. So from a structural approach, since as I've said, like it goes against basic constitutional principles, there could be an argument to be made that it also goes against our constitutional architecture, and to institute a constitutional challenge on that basis. We could also argue that some indigenous charter protected or constitutionally protected indigenous rights are being infringed and institute a challenge on that basis. And the other side of that is if we wait and see how the bill, more specifically Schedule 9, is being applied, this could lead us to, for instance, Section 8 or Section 15 charter rights. So Section 7 and Section 15, sorry. So Section 7, for instance, life, liberty, and security of the person. Section 15, equality rights. And again, depending on how it's being applied, maybe the additional provisions of the charter would be relevant.
Thank you. Laura, do you want to add anything to that?
I think that was pretty comprehensive review of all of the things that could potentially be challenged. So no, I won't add any more.
Okay, let's go on to a couple of others just around where the bill is going and what our plans are. Will Environmental Defense or today's presenters be presenting at the Legislative Assembly? I think the answer to that is yes. I don't know who all will be chosen, but a number of us have applied to be presenters at the committee hearing, so we'll be doing that. Other question here is the bill has passed second reading. How much time do we have to stop this bill? Well, we know that the committee hearings will wrap up on the 26th of May and that the government will then bring it back to the legislature, either with revisions recommended by that committee and vote on those, or just try and ram it right through and get it voted on third reading. But we have no schedule for that, but we anticipate that would be into early June. I don't actually recall when the legislature is scheduled to recess for the summer, but I do believe it's in June. So I think their objective would be to try and pass this bill before that happens, earlier this spring or late this spring or early in the summer. Even if all opposition MPPs are on board, is that number enough to push back on this bill? The answer to that is no. Opposition MPPs alone, because the government has a majority in the legislature, they would not be able to stop it. They are members of the committee. They're minority members of the committee that is reviewing the bill, so they'd be able to raise issues and suggest as parties, both the Liberals and the NDP, changes to the bill and put forward amendments, which the majority government, that being the Conservatives, Progressive Conservatives, would be able to vote those down because they have a majority in that committee, but they would be able to bring forward changes to the bill. I think the key here is to make sure that the government MPPs are hearing as loudly or more loudly from citizens around Ontario about what's wrong with this bill and why it shouldn't pass as those in the opposition. If you recall, when we all got together and decided that we weren't going to let them get away with destroying the Greenbelt, it was government MPPs who eventually put the premier out in front of the cameras at their caucus retreat in the Niagara Peninsula and made him say that he made a mistake. So it's the heat that gets applied to the government MPPs that ultimately can stop these things from going in the direction that they are if they're broadly offside with where the Ontario public wants it to be. And I think that is going to be very, very much key in this circumstance. So reaching out to government MPPs is important. If you are someone who lives in a riding that has a government MPP there, you obviously should be communicating with them via email or writing to them. But I would strongly, strongly request that you also phone them and demand a meeting with them, and preferably take a bunch of your neighbors with you and just tell them that they had better make sure this bill doesn't pass, or they're going to have you following them around for the next 4 years and making their life very difficult for betraying you and the rest of the people in your riding. So that's the most powerful way to make a statement to your MPP if they're a government person. Let's see if there's any others here. Our municipalities organizing against this. Should we be writing our local councils to demand they oppose the bill? And how aware are municipalities about this, the implications of this bill? I think you should be reaching out to your councils. I think if you have upcoming council meetings, you should try and get on the agenda. They may be some organizing going on that I'm not aware of, but I think they're going to be most prone to paying more attention to this bill if they're hearing from their constituents directly. And they really need to be showing up and opposing it. I'm not saying that they're not, because I just don't know. You may see some of the individual municipalities or their association applying to present a committee or doing media work. I just haven't seen it yet. But you really should be reaching out to your councils if you have the bandwidth and the time to do that. What else do I have here? A housekeeping item, and I'll come back to this a little bit at the end because we are going to need to wrap up now. Is this webinar being recorded for those who couldn't attend? And yes, it is, and it'll be available to everyone who signed up. It'll be available in the follow-up email that we send out, and there'll be a link in there, and you'll be able to listen to it. Other people have asked if there's going to be a printed transcript of it, and there's not. Although I do believe that there is software available online that you can put a recording into it, and it'll give you a text translation of that. It's not always the most accurate, but I'm sure AI is probably making it a lot better than it used to be. So you might want to try that, but we will have a recording of it available for everyone who participated. So I am going to wrap up now because we're almost at 8 o'clock. So you can see from the information presented tonight and the conversation that we had here together that our province is under attack by our own government. When he was elected, or re-elected rather, 3 months ago, Premier Ford said he needed a mandate to protect Ontario. He needed a mandate to protect Ontario from US attacks, and he got it. But he never told us that the mandate that he was seeking was to wreck the values we hold most sacred, or to turn over vast swaths of our province to lawless destruction by his hand-picked friends. We live in unsure times where a lot of our world is threatened by anti-democratic forces, economic instability, high costs, and climate change. We want governments to deliver stability and a safe route forward in these challenging times, not agents of chaos pouring fuel on fires that threaten us. But we know that we must do, and we must fight to defend our future, fight for our province, our communities, and our families. I want all of you who are here tonight to commit to talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors, talk to your families, send a letter to your member of parliament and to Premier Doug Ford, better phone them, demand a meeting, go online. In the chat, we're posting all of the actions you can take by organizations that are participating in this joint effort. There's one from Environmental Defense, one from Ecojustice, one from Wildlife Conservation Society Canada, Justina's organization. And make sure that you promise yourself also this spring to get outside this spring and summer, see all the special places that we have in this province, all the wonderful wildlife, all the beauty, and the remarkable values that they give to you and your community and your family, and think about what we can all do to save them from this incredibly horrible bill. And now I want to thank all of our supporters. I want to take a moment to thank all of you for tuning in and participating in today's webinar. It's really, really encouraging for all of us who work on this every day to see hundreds of you showing up in an evening to learn and to commit to take action. Also, thanks to all of our speakers today, Justina Ray, Laura Bowman, Anaïs, Bussières, McNicoll, for all their expertise and insights today, and for all of the folks at Environmental Defense who did all the technical things to make this happen. Thank you so much for being here, and have a great evening, and let's stop this bill.